Thank you very much. I'd like to also extend my thanks to all of you for coming to this lecture, to Dr. Paradise and Dr. Schroeder for inviting me to speak here. It is a pleasure it's actually a pleasure to be able to travel again and actually go to events in person. Zoom was great until you realize that you really weren't having those interesting conversations that you have before and after and over coffee and directly with folks when you're in person. Thank you to Marielle for helping organize and making all this happen, and to Hillel, of course, for hosting me today. I'm fortunate to be relatively close, so I just drove down from Duluth this morning, blessed as we are with some relatively decent temperatures and weather. But it is great to have to help perhaps build some bridges between our two sister campuses of the University of Minnesota system. My talk, and I know that the title kind of switched around a little bit, but is titled Searching for Rodina. Rodina in Russian means homeland, Diaries of Soviet Jewish Evacuees on the Soviet home front during the Second World War. So I actually wanted to start by giving you a quote from one of the diaries that I'm going to be discussing, because I think it's actually the opening quote from this diary, because I think it puts us right in the center of the events and lenses that I will be talking about in this talk. So the quote, and I apologize for when we talk about diaries, there's lots of text, so I apologize for all the text. Hopefully it won't be too much. So this year will forever remain in the memories of millions of people all over the world. I too will remember the events of this year for a long time. I'm only 19 years old. I was raised and educated in the Soviet state, a country where the exploitation of one human being by another is unknown. This is a 19-year-old. Where a person can breathe so freely. But I will not write about this. Any citizen of the Soviet Union knows this. The peoples of all countries know this. I only want to write in my story about the events of this year, rather about recent events which began on June 22nd, 1941. But all the same, I will not begin right away writing about the war of the Soviet Union with Germany. My goal is to describe the home front. And because of this, I want to familiarize my reader, it sounds silly even to me. After all, no one will read this. With the characters of this story and where and how they met the outbreak of the war. These are the opening lines of a diary of a young woman named Anna Dashevskaya, who originated from Ukraine and was alongside millions of other people, including over 1 million Soviet Jews, was evacuated and or fled from the areas of the Soviet Union that were under threat of occupation and were soon to be occupied by the Nazi regime, by the Nazi army, the Wehrmacht, to the Soviet home front, so to the unoccupied areas of the Soviet Union, the Urals, Siberia, Kazakhstan, Central Asia. These are the territories to which I'm referring to. Dashevskaya, the author of this quote, of course, here refers to June 22nd, 1941, which was the day of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, which prompted the beginning of a mass dislocation of civilians as well as industry from the areas of the Soviet Union that were eventually occupied or under threat of occupation, as I mentioned, to safer places further east. The project that I'm working on largely deals with the daily life experiences of these displaced people, these evacuees, as they're referred to by the Soviet state, both Jewish and non-Jewish actually, who fled or were evacuated from the territories of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Western Russian Soviet Federative Republic, and resettled in Soviet Siberia, Central Asia, the Urals, and the Volga region. The data that we have on the size of this population is not surprisingly incomplete. Wartime is not a great time for accurate statistics. Statistics tell us that wartime is not a great time to keep accurate statistics. And in fact, ranges of the Soviet evacuee population range from 6 to 25 million, which you don't have to know a lot of math to know that that's a big range. But it is incontrovertible that the Soviet state orchestrated or experienced the largest civilian evacuation operation of any of the European combatants, largely because they had a large population and they had territory to send them to that didn't end up being occupied. I use the number 16.5 million. That is the kind of the number that's most cited, and I think it's probably the closest that we have. Of that number, approximately 1 to 1.25 million were Jews. Again, there's a lack of data here, in particular because Soviet authorities didn't always record the ethnic background of the evacuees. Importantly, these people constitute the largest group of Jewish survivors in Europe of the Holocaust. Soviet Jews who were evacuated or fled to unoccupied territories, as well as Polish Jewish refugees who were often deported or fled from the annexed territories that were annexed in 1939, and again ended up in the Soviet interior, constitute the largest group of survivors. Today, I'd like to focus on a specific subset of sources on this population, specifically diaries penned by Soviet Jewish evacuees. Really, I'm talking about 2 diaries here. The diaries, largely because of their immediacy and personal nature, can be incredibly useful, of course, for historians, particularly for a project related to social history and identity. In this case, they're particularly important because most of the other sources that we have are memoirs written decades after the fact, so subject to the effects of memory and hindsight. Diaries, of course, are, while of course by no stretch of the imagination a perfect source, but a much more immediate source. Moreover, due to the series of political and historical circumstances, including Cold War realities and perceptions of the USSR, narratives of evacuation and displacement in the USSR have not received the attention they deserve. So traditionally, the story has been largely marginalized until recently. And it certainly doesn't seem to fit into the story of Holocaust survival, the traditional narrative of Holocaust survival that I'm sure most of you are more used to hearing about. So the 2 diaries that I'll be discussing today are that of Dashevskaya, who I've already introduced you to, who was born in 1922 in Kamenka, Ukraine, in central Ukraine. She came to Kiev to study at university before the war. She was evacuated with her sisters and eventually spent the majority of her time in Uralsk in western Kazakhstan. So this is actually her journey from Kamenka. They spent a bit of time in this area here, Surovikino. Were initially sent to Almaty, which was the capital of Soviet Kazakhstan, and then ended up in Uralsk, noted there in northwestern Kazakhstan. In her diary, I located in the I worked with at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum archives initially. The original source was the Judaica Institute archive in Kiev. The other diarist was Efim Talanka, who was born in 1926 in Kharkov, Ukraine. He was evacuated with his mother and brother to the city of Molotov, which is current-day Perm, in the Ural Mountains. His brother was mobilized into the Red Army and went missing in 1942. Talanka and his mother returned to Kharkov in 1944, and his diary is preserved at the Yad Vashem archive. So there is a map of Talanka's journey from Kharkiv to Perm, with some stops along the way. This just gives you a sense of course, Google Maps, but I can promise you that it took more than 30 hours in a car, because in most cases evacuation journeys took weeks and even months, because of the nature of the infrastructure and railroad travel and all kinds of factors. So no, it did not take 24 hours, or in this case 100 hours. It took much longer. But this kind of gives you a sense of the scale of this dislocation, right? These people weren't being moved to the next town over, or even to the next region over. They were internally displaced within their own country, the Soviet Union, but they were internally displaced to places that were very unfamiliar and strikingly different from anything they had ever been familiar with, both in terms of lifestyle, culture, economic circumstances. In many cases, evacuees spend a significant amount of time, evacuees who are mostly urbanites, spend a significant amount of time in rural areas, largely because there wasn't housing for them in urban areas. And this was a real culture clash, right? Because these people were really not familiar with life in the rural areas and on collective farms in the Soviet Union. These two authors provide interesting and useful perspectives, since both were born and raised during the Soviet period in the 1920s, in towns and cities in Ukraine where significant populations of Jews resided. They're part of what is referred to as the Soviet generation, people who were educated during the Soviet era and experienced the war during a transformative years of their late adolescence and youth. It is also significant to point out that this generation of Soviet Jews who reached adulthood in the immediate post-war years were those who were either in evacuation or at the front, since tragically so few of those who remained on the occupied territories survived the war. So these evacuees essentially constitute, made up a big chunk of the generation of post-war Jews, essentially, who were born before. Post-war Soviet Jews, I apologize, who were born, before the war. Case in point, I myself was born in Moscow. That's where my family is from, the Soviet Union. My three of my grandparents are Jewish. All three were Jewish. All three of them were in evacuation during the war. That is how they survived. So there's much to say about these sources, and I'm not going to keep you here until midnight. So, so on a basic level, what do these tell us? What do they reveal about the evacuation experience? What do they tell us about their authors? And importantly, what do they reveal to us that is distinct from the material that can be gathered from other sources? These diaries reveal the way in which the war provided caused a fundamental break in the lives of the diarists, a before and after. There was a before June 22nd, 41, and an after June 22nd, 41. In reflecting on his upcoming 16th birthday, Talanka writes, "Could I ever have thought that on my birthday last year that I would be celebrating my 16th birthday in these circumstances? On my birthday last year, I ate a tasty cake prepared by my mother's skillful hand. And now, if we live to see it, I will eat dry bread with water." These reflections highlight not only the dramatic changes that diarists experienced, but also represent an attempt to connect personal milestones like birthdays with historical events. And at the same time, the diarists, like Dashevskaya in that first quote I showed you, struggle with their own impetus for writing. Were they simply writing for themselves, for their families, or some broader audience? Was it a coping mechanism? In fact, And throughout the war, the diarists often go back and forth, putting away the diary for months and then coming back to it, partly as a reflection of their moods and their need to express themselves. And the diaries that we're looking at here really served all of these needs. Dashevskaya writes about keeping the diary for the benefit of her young niece, who's born in evacuation. Her sisters encourage her to keep writing, and she hopes that the diary will help tell her niece the story of her early years. This activity has a life-affirming purpose, to document survival at a time of loss and uncertainty. Throughout the diary, Dashevskaya expresses her and her sisters' understandable anxiety over their own fates and the fates of their parents and other loved ones who did not evacuate with them. Turning to Talanka, the first section of Talanka's diary is actually filled with minute reports of events at the front, as reported by the Soviet Information Bureau, the Soviet press. He assiduously records troop movements, victories, and defeats, as well as any actions on the part of the Soviet Union's allies. Later on, the diary gets more personal and analytical, and my perspective interesting. But on February 27th of 42, he writes, "As a witness of the Second World War, sitting here on the home front, our own Soviet shortcomings, which are not written about in the press or elsewhere, have become clear to me." So Talanka sees himself in this role of witness, observer, survivor, who's going to record what is happening. The diaries reveal much of what we can learn from other types of sources. Evacuees often had to leave their hometowns hurriedly, endured long and difficult journeys to the east, and faced a series of challenges when they arrived at their destinations, from finding housing to an employment, securing enough food for their families, to acquiring winter clothes, taking care of kids and elderly relatives. All of the difficulties that you associate with everyday life, especially in the context of migration, refugeedom in some ways, and what you associate with a wartime crisis situation in which resources were scarce to begin with. The evacuation experience was characterized by uncertainty about where one would end up, one's immediate and long-term future, worries and anxieties about family, relatives back home, and loved ones at the front, as well as frequent mobility. So I think the diaries are kind of serve an important purpose to helping people feel rooted in some ways. The arrival of millions of evacuees led to overcrowding and exacerbated pre-existing shortages in peripheral areas. This led to tensions with the local population. Relations were also exacerbated by misunderstandings. Evacuees were often urbanites, as I had mentioned. Most were Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, or Jewish in terms of ethnic background. And in some cases, they were resettled, as I had mentioned, within rural non-Slavic communities, and in some cases in Slavic communities where the groups struggled to relate to one another. Again, this sort of gets us into this odd gray area where they're internally displaced, but to places that are relatively foreign to them. But for the rest of this talk, I really want to focus more on how, in the process of this experience, these evacuees are dealing with their own sense of identity, belonging, and here this is framed within this concept of Rodina. What is my homeland? Where do I belong? Who am I? These diaries allow us to follow these individuals more carefully throughout the war and witness at least part of the transformation wrought upon them by these wartime experiences, things that you don't really get in a letter or a report or even a memoir written decades after the fact. Did they see themselves as Soviet citizens first and foremost? Did they ascribe to, how did they feel about their Jewish identity? Did they ascribe to a regional identity? And how does this Jewish identity figure into their self-identification? And what I would like to argue here is that on the one hand, these diaries reveal a really multi-layered sense of identity that is at the same time Soviet, Ukrainian, and Jewish. And at the same time, the transformation of these young people, as recorded in their diaries, of course, shows us kind of a fracturing of and a questioning of their identity as a result of what they experienced during the war. Let us begin with the case of Talanka. Throughout the diary, Talanka repeats Soviet propaganda slogans. And his diary is just like, so it's really fun for historians, I guess. Maybe this tells you more about what historians think is fun or not. But he not only has this diary, but he illustrates like the covers of his notebooks. So and writes like slogans on them, and it includes clippings from newspapers. So it's not just the text. It's like it's a fun source to work with. So for example. For example, here we have, this is the first notebook, I think, and it says the Diary of the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet People Against German Fascism. On the cover of this notebook, he writes, sorry, did I put it here? Our mission is right. The enemy will be destroyed. The victory will be ours. Right. So he inscribes these kind of patriotic slogans. Interestingly, in this notebook, he writes, "Proletarians of all nations unite," which is a very typical Soviet slogan that appeared in the masthead of Pravda and other mastheads. So he's clearly reading newspapers and also just kind of like almost, I mean, I'm sure it's intentional, but he's sort of copying that masthead. At the same time, he also writes just below the Proletarians Unite, he writes, "Under Stalin's leadership, we have been victorious. Under Stalin's leadership, we will be victorious." So, again, very typical slogans of the time. On December 25th, 41, Telanka finishes his entry with the words, "Long live our great leader, Vozhd, and the organizer of our victories, our commander, Comrade Stalin." This is completely understandable. If Talanka was born in 26, 41, he is 15. He's repeating things that he sees around him. He is patriotic, right? It's wartime. He wants the Soviet Union to win. He expresses that in his diary. This is a very kind of patriotic Soviet identity, we'll put it that way. On March 5th, 42, he writes, "Soviet power has existed for 25 years, and it is unlikely that the Germans will be able to topple it. Soviet power is that for which our fathers have shed blood, and that which I must build and strengthen, and one does not regret giving one's life for it." He personalizes here the sort of information that he gleans from the propaganda and from the newspapers. And in fact, throughout the diary, he struggles with the fact that he himself is not at the battlefront as a young man. He's just on that cusp of being recruited, and actually doesn't end up being mobilized. Time and time again, he refers to his Soviet homeland, his Rodina, writing, "My homeland was never a slave. The boastful Friedrich II said, 'It is not enough to kill a Russian, one must also topple him.' Sooner than rather than later, the flag of the Soviets will shine over our dear Rodnoi," again, same source, stem, Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians would really take issue with that. characterization, Karelia and Crimea in Leningrad region, and overall Soviet land. Interestingly here, he is conflating sort of imperial references to imperial Russian history with Frederick II and Soviet identity and patriotism. In concluding his diary for November 6th, 1941, Talanka writes, "Tomorrow is November 7th, the 24th anniversary of the Great October Revolution. 3 years later, with the Soviet victory within reach, the occasion prompts Telanka to reflect on and celebrate the accomplishments of the Red Army and the sacrifices made by his older brother and millions like him. He decides to commit himself more fully to the Soviet project by studying Marxist philosophy and joining the Youth Communist League." Dashevskaya is much less disciplined than Telanka in writing regularly, but she takes care to note key dates of significance for the family, including the typical Soviet holidays, specifically May 1st, Labor Day, and talks about them celebrating the holiday with friends in Uralsk. In late October of that year, 42, Dashevskaya attends a special performance in the theater to mark the upcoming 25th anniversary of the revolution. So in spite of their changed surroundings, these diarists clung to the rituals and traditions that had held meaning for them within kind of the traditional Soviet context and pantheon of heroes and key dates. At the same time, we see the cracks develop relatively quickly. Both diarists' faith and belief in the Soviet cause is tested by what they see around them. Time and time again, they are distressed to find not only their living conditions lacking, but to find that the local population they encounter is often unprincipled and ignorant in their view. They see that these people don't meet what they consider to be Soviet standards. Of course, a big part of this has to do with the socioeconomic, educational, professional, and geographic differences between evacuees and locals. But they talk about the fact that these people are not committed Soviets, that they spread anti-Semitism, that they don't relate to the significance of their work and of the war effort. In spring of 42, Dashevskaya's description of her workplace environment at the plant where she worked reveals a sense of disappointment and isolation. And again, clearly a very biased portrayal. She writes, "There's not a single decent human being in our department. All are stupid, uncultured, ignorant. There's literally no one to talk to." But there is this sort of gap in the sense that evacuees in general find it difficult to talk to, not in the sense of could you pass me the wrench, but have a conversation with local populations because they have just such different backgrounds. So it's instead of what she expected, they expected as the expected camaraderie born of shared suffering and a shared war effort, Talanka also feels isolated in Molotov and describes those who surround him as strangely individualistic. War. He writes this on April 24th, 43. "I live on the Soviet home front. I experience a breakdown. Yes, I am a young communist, but we don't have a real comradely collective. It is hard to set my feelings down on paper. On the home front, the I of a socially engaged person is replaced with the I of a vile bourgeois. Let's take the issue of food. Here, everyone strives to deprive another so that he can take more for himself." In other cases, he refers to the riffraff in Molotov who are spreading rumors about Jews. And in the context of this partial crisis of faith, again, coming at this critical moment, both of these people, based on their diaries, come into this moment with a lot of naivete, perhaps, and idealism. But that's, breaking down here. The diarists look for a sense of belonging elsewhere. And specifically, they look for it in their Ukrainian, in a regional identity to their Ukrainian hometowns, and in their Jewish identity. Throughout the diary, Talanka dedicates particular attention to the capture and succeeding liberations of his hometown of Kharkiv. It is very painful that we're speaking at a time when the occupation of Kharkiv needs to be specified in terms of decades, and that we have seen Kharkiv occupied yet again in the past year by a different enemy power, of course. And he yearns time and time again to return to his native Ukraine. These are just some of the cutouts from newspapers that he includes specifically about battles in Kharkiv. He yearns to leave Molotov, a place he finds increasingly depressing. Writing in April of 42, that spring has come to Molotov, but it is not, in his words, a Ukrainian spring. Going on to write, "Oh, will I see you again, my dear Ukraine, my native Kharkiv, what is left of you? My homeland, Ukraine. Thoughts of you nourish me." So this of course is now a different conception of Rodina, right? That's rooted in Ukraine. I think it's rooted in this regional identity of Kharkiv specifically, really. In as much as the earlier quote, Talanka identifies himself with both a Russian and a Soviet homeland. In other places, he writes about his dear Ukrainian people and all that they have suffered. He even quotes a famous poem, the Testament, by Ukraine's national poet and considered one of the greatest poets and national figures of Ukraine, Taras Shevchenko. In an entry from late December 41, Talanka interestingly switches into Ukrainian language to write, "You will be free, my people. The Red Army will liberate you from the bloody paws of the German fascists. The hour is nigh, long live free Soviet Ukraine." And I would argue that the language choices and the emphasis on the liberation of Ukraine here is deliberate. It suggests the way that Talanka chooses to concretize his patriotism and affirm his allegiance to Ukraine and Kharkiv specifically. And this page includes, I just was fascinated by these particular excerpts where Talanka switches back and forth between Russian and Ukrainian. So he writes, "Ukraina, моя Ukraina," which in Ukrainian, Ukraine, my Ukraine. My fatherland, my fatherland, also in Ukrainian. Then he switches, "Soon it will be May 1st, a battle review of the forces of resistance against the advance of reaction," in Russian. Now here, of course, he's referring more to the Soviet sort of, May 1st is a Soviet holiday, and that's kind of why that date is important. But then he switches back to Ukrainian to write, "Long live Ukraine." On the other page is the quote from Shevchenko, from Shevchenko's testament, where he says where he wants to be buried, and Talanka quotes him in the Ukrainian. "Mark my grave there and arise, sundering your chains. Bless your freedom with the blood of foemen's evil veins." Shevchenko was a 19th century poet. He wasn't writing in the 20th century. So, but he is a Ukrainian national poet. So there again, Talanka is making the connection with Ukraine's struggle for independence and freedom in the 19th century, kind of against the Russians, to the conflict with the Germans. And then he continues in Ukrainian, but this is not quoting it any longer. He writes, "You will be free, my people." Narod, my narod. Narod means people. "The Red Army will liberate you from the bloody paws of the German fascists. As I mentioned, the hour is nigh. Long live free Soviet Ukraine." At the same time, through the course of his experiences in evacuation and after his return home, Talanka becomes ever more aware of his Jewish identity. On November 19th, 1941, he records that 75,000 Jews had been murdered in Kiev and Odessa, which is significant not only because he identifies those murdered as Jews, not as Soviet civilians, but also because it is one of the few instances in the diary in which he discusses civilian losses. On April 25th, 1943, he comments that there is a marked growth of hostility towards Jews among, again, what he refers to as the riffraff at the market and Molotov, and among the students of vocational schools. Later that summer, he returns to the topic and notes that local residents seem to feel that all the problems associated with the war are the fault of the Jews. This is a common commentary in that evacuation meant many more people were vying for the same pool of resources. It's created scarcities, and it created lots of frustration with evacuees. And because there were all these rumors going around that there were so many, the Jews were overrepresented among the evacuee population, and because you couldn't really speak out and say, oh, evacuation is a bad idea because this was a state-sponsored project, anti-Semitism became a vehicle through which that frustration and anger was expressed by, on the grassroots level. And that's kind of what he's seeing here. Talanka attributes the growth of anti-Semitism on the home front to the activism of enemy elements and the unsophisticated, uncultured, poorly educated, and un-Sovietized Molotov residents. So during his time in Molotov, Talanka writes off many problematic phenomenon by referring to the backwardness of Molotov residents. However, by the time he is returned to Kharkiv in 1944, that reasoning no longer applies. And in fact, what he returns to is a resurgence of anti-Semitism in Soviet Ukraine. In early 1945, Talanka writes of his regret at not having served at the front and reflects that the war has taught me little. I have learned that my nationality is scorned by large segments of the population for cowardliness, though it must be said that their Hitlerite propaganda may be at play. In the months that follow, he seems to have a bit of a literal crisis, at least according to the diary. Because he sees himself deemed a second-class citizen and a foreigner in his own hometown, the hometown that he had been writing this whole time that he was so desperate to return to, leading him to feel that he doesn't have a Rodina anymore. It's gone. It's not Kharkiv. It's certainly not Molotov. And he doesn't know what this Jewish identity, what this Jewish Rodina would look like. So despite what he had written earlier about his love for his Soviet and Ukrainian homelands, for him, Jewishness becomes emblematic of the loss and estrangement that he suffers as a result of displacement and the growth of anti-Semitism. He struggles with a sense of his own irrelevance and insignificance. He describes the pejorative attitude towards him in the following words. You're of a different nationality, pejorative attitude from others, non-Jews in his community. You're of a different nationality, you're a Jew, but you live in Russia and Ukraine. You're an unnecessary person here, and I am left, like the eternal Jew, to wander about looking for my long-lost homeland, my holy Jerusalem. Where can the Jewish people create their homeland? Russia needs you like a foreign automobile, which after the first breakdown will be junked. Here he's reflecting much more faith in the Russian automobile industry than is warranted, but be that as it may, he's still young. You're a stranger here, and the path to leadership is not open to you. You must dig around in the dirt and enviously look up at the person who may in fact be worth less than you, but he is Russian, so keep your head down, Jewish nation. What does homeland mean to me? For some, this is a hallowed memory of a small house where he was born and grew up, his loved and dear ones. For me, this notion doesn't exist. whether these attitudes are, whether he's exaggerating or not, again, he's a teenager. He feels isolated and sees himself as the object of scorn and derision in his own hometown. And he writes later, May 2nd, 1945, a week later, "Why was I born a Jew and not an Englishman or a Frenchman? Why do I not have my own homeland, my Rodina?" The case of Dashevskaya, and I'll have a little bit less to say about this one, but the case of Dashevskaya is somewhat less stark, but parallels Talanka's reflections in several important ways. Faced with the challenges of the war and evacuation, Dashevskaya finds comfort in recollections of Kamenka, the shtetl in central Ukraine where she was born and raised. This is significant because Dashevskaya had experienced the typical upward mobility that we see of Soviet Jews in the 20s and 30s. She'd been raised in Kamenka, and then she went off to Kiev to university, which many Jews did. But here we see her retreating back to those memories of her hometown, where she finds a sense of, for which she feels a great deal of nostalgia. Throughout the war, Dashevskaya and her companions are desperate to hear news of Kamenka and express joy whenever they encounter or hear from a zemlyak, a countryman. Zemlya in Russian means earth or soil. Upon relating daydreams about reuniting with her parents, Dashevskaya reflects, "How dear is one's homeland, specifically homeland in the full meaning of that term, the place where I was born. One feels it especially when one is in a foreign land." Again, chuzbina, a foreign land. She identifies Kazakhstan as foreign, Uralsk as foreign, despite the fact that it is Soviet, and does not know when one will return there. "But I am convinced that I will return there, and this hope sustains me." In the lines that follow, Dashevskaya proceeds to take the imagined reader. Again, she doesn't think there's going to be a reader, maybe her niece, on a walk through her favorite spots in her native town of Kamenka. It is indicative here that she specifies that she's particularly nostalgic for her hometown, not her Soviet homeland more broadly. And of course that she identifies Uralsk as a foreign land or as a chuzbina, where she does not belong, she hopes that her stay there will be temporary. Interestingly, she also sort of mentions between the lines that she and her sisters are often speaking to their little niece, that, as I said, was born in evacuation, in Ukrainian. And she says the decision to speak to her in Ukrainian was an unconscious one, but it suggests that the family is trying to ensure that this child that was born in the process of migration and displacement is able to identify with her Ukrainian quote-unquote homeland, despite not having spent the first years of her life there. She writes also that Clara has found a friend in their building, the child of evacuees from Leningrad, who was, and this here I'm quoting her, she writes, "born just like Clara, not in her homeland." The irony here is that the noun homeland in Russian shares a stem with the word to be born. Roditsa, it means to be born. Rodina is homeland. As a result, the literal translation here would be that these two children were born not in their birthplace. So they're born outside of the place where they're supposed to be. And it seems that in the choice of language that suggests that that place would be Ukraine. The phrasing and the language choices underscore the conviction that these children retain a birthplace elsewhere, despite the dislocations foisted upon their families by the war. Moreover, the use of non-Russian languages serves as a way for evacuees to forge bonds with others who have been displaced. Dashevskaya also speaking matter-of-factly, talks about making a new acquaintance in Uralsk because they heard each other, because they heard each other speaking Yiddish in the street, or they overheard this person speaking Yiddish and figured out that, of course, okay, this is a Jewish evacuee, and that they got to know this person and became friends. The language, in this case Yiddish, serves as a common identifier between them, allowing the evacuees to find one another. In fact, being separated from her loved ones in her hometown seems to reinforce Dashevska's nostalgia for Jewish culture. In one instance, she recalls hearing a Yiddish song titled Childhood Years that brought her and her companions in Uralsk to tears. And we have this sense that, again, before the war, she was in many ways a relatively assimilated Soviet Jew, or at least going down that path. But it is that the war and the sense of both dislocation and disillusionment that forces her to go back to some of these traditions she had earlier jettisoned. A particularly memorable episode occurred when the family gathered to celebrate Rosh Hashanah in the fall of 1943. Dashevska writes that she and her sister did not have a tradition of celebrating the holiday in Kiev, noting that they didn't even know where it was. But marking it with her friends in Uralsk, and this here I believe she's referring to these Yiddish-speaking friends, allowed Dashevska to reminisce about the happy days of her childhood when they would celebrate Rosh Hashanah at home with her parents. Though I do not believe in religious traditions, but I remember that in my childhood we marked these days with great joy. Everything was tidied up in the house, scrubbed, clean, and everyone wore their nicest outfits. It would happen that for 2 days beforehand, Mom would cook and bake the most varied and delicious dishes. In the evening before Mom and Dad returned from the synagogue, the table would already be set, and the kids awaited the arrival of the parents. True, the older we got, the less frequently we celebrated these holidays, as the October days, the celebration of the October Revolution, which, as I like to remind my students, obviously happened in November. Because the Soviets like to make life difficult for you. And May 1st and others became the most important holidays for us. So she's indicating a switch from Jewish holidays and rituals to Soviet holidays and rituals. My parents continued to celebrate the Jewish holidays also. All the same, these remained the happiest memories of the past. In Dashevska's analysis, it's clear that this episode is meaningful to her, not because of religious significance necessarily, but because it allows her to maintain a connection, albeit tenuous, with a pre-war past and with her loved ones and with her hometown, right? With this sense of Rodina that is connected with both Ukraine and it's also connected with Jewishness. So Jewish culture and tradition serves as a way to remedy the sense of rootlessness and isolation that she experiences in evacuation. So this Rosh Hashanah celebration allows her and her sisters to cast their minds back to their childhood and think about a past that seemed to be ever more distant yet ever more dear and meaningful because of the separation from her loved ones and her hometown and the sense of foreignness that she was experiencing in evacuation. So, as I have argued here, the Talanka's and Dashevska's diaries, and obviously these are two sources about two people, so we can't, I'm not trying to argue here that they're representative of all, Jews or Ukrainian Jews, but they allow us the opportunity not only to learn about life on the home front and evacuation, but to gain insight into what evacuees knew at the time, how they interpreted the events through which they were living, and how they understood their own place in this changing world that was literally changing around them. They give us a privileged glimpse into multifaceted ways in which individuals conceived of their own identities through the prism of their Soviet citizenship, the prism of their regional and hometown affiliation, and their identity as Jews. They do indicate that over the course of the war, due to the realities of displacement, separation from home, tensions on the home front, particularly anti-Semitism. Some evacuees, among those who were very much assimilated and Sovietized, became ever more critical, or at least began to question that Soviet identity, and became much more cognizant and conscious of their Jewishness and the implications of their Jewish identity. So again, I see this as revealing these multifaceted ways in which these individuals identified as Soviets, as Ukrainians, as Jews, but also how that the war, and particularly the experience of displacement, shook their sense of themselves, and began to force them to make choices between how they would understand their homeland, and they began to question their position within the Soviet Union, especially as a result of this of the problems that they become aware of on the home front. So thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to. I believe we have some time, so I'm happy to take questions.
Time for questions. Who would like to break the ice?
Yes.
What happened to all these evacuees after the war, and was the answer different depending on whether they were Jewish?
No, largely no.
Maybe I'll repeat the question.
Yes. What happened to, so the great question, the question was what happened to the evacuees after the war, and did their Jewish identity play a role in their post-war trajectories? So the Soviets didn't really differentiate between, the Soviet state officially did not use really ethnic categories when they thought about categorize their evacuated population. It was really much more about affiliation. You were evacuated if you were someone in your family was affiliated with a certain industry, a certain ministry, a certain organization that was being evacuated. Jews were not evacuated as Jews. Jews were evacuated because the Soviets did not make particular provisions for Jewish evacuees as such. Re-evacuation worked similarly in that most people returned home after the war, some sooner than others, because if you're working with a defense plant that's being sent back, you have that priority that you can get on those transports. But a lot of plants, for example, industrial plants, didn't go back. They remained in the places where they had been sent. So some people had a much harder time getting permission to come home. Still, the majority of evacuees eventually found ways to get back home. Some stayed in the places where they had ended up. Interestingly, because we see a rise of anti-Semitism in the immediate post-war period in the Soviet Union, it seems that some Jews had the kind of sixth sense that maybe being in Ukraine was not a great idea at the moment, and essentially decided and opted to stay in places like Kazakhstan, where anti-Semitism after the war was not nearly as big of a problem. So when I did my research in Kazakhstan, I met a woman whose family had that experience, and she kind of turned to me at one point and she said, in the 1950s, Almaty was the capital of the Kazakh Republic, was a really Jewish city. And I was like, I don't think anybody other than this person would tell me that Almaty was the Jewish city. But what she meant was that she went to university at the time, and a lot of the professors were Jews, because a lot of these people were people who had stayed after the war. And these were people that were either they had a good position there and they decided that they just wanted to keep it, or they kind of had this sort of sense that things would be better there than back home. But yes, the majority of it was not an easy return for many people, but the majority of people returned home. Thank you. Yes?
Did the community create Jewish community structures? Did the Did the authorities allow them to do that?
Yeah, so the question was whether in evacuation, you mean? Whether the community, whether Jewish community structures and practices were created at sites of resettlement. I actually have a piece an article that talks about that, but you can email me if you're interested in reading that. Yes and no. There were Jewish spaces, synagogue, shuls that were created at these sites. A lot of these efforts were actually spearheaded by the Polish Jewish refugees. So people who had not been Soviet citizens before '39 and therefore were much more traditional than the Soviets. Interestingly, the state is struggling for its survival, in 41, 42. They're not so concerned with cracking down on this sort of thing. The Soviet Jews are interested in these functions, or things like Jewish weddings took place, but they're very cautious because they understand the implications in the Soviet Union of being seen as practicing religion. So they participate, but sort of on the down low, is what happens. But there is Jewish communal life, and you can describe it that way, at sites of resettlement, for sure. Yeah, great question.
Bob, can I get a second one? Akasha. I don't remember if it was Dashevskaya or the other diary, but they talk about that we don't have a homeland and so on. So were there Zionist movements at all in this group?
Yeah, the Zionists, not really among the Soviet Jews. Again, I would think that is so a large contingent of Poles and Polish Jews who were living in eastern Poland and were next to the Soviet Union in '39. A large contingent of those people were deported by the Soviet state between '39 and '41, not because they were Jewish, but because of typical Soviet reasons: problematic class background, problematic political background. Zionism would be one. Sent to the Gulag. In the summer of '41, the Polish government in exile and the Soviets signed an amnesty, and they let these people out, largely amnesty them from the Gulag. It's summer of '41. These people have nowhere to go. Most of them go to Central Asia. This is, as I like to say to my students, this is like the only scenario in which being deported to the Gulag is actually a good thing, because that's how those people survive. At least some of them survive. Obviously, some of them perished in the Gulag and in evacuation. So they are, and most of them go to Central Asia in part because of the climate, in part because they can't go home. Some argue that one of the reasons they went to Central Asia was that they thought that there'd maybe be a chance to get to Palestine from Central Asia. That didn't really happen, but except with a small contingent that's part of a different story. But so I think there was Zionist leanings among them, but certainly Zionists among them. But the Soviet Jews, I think for the most part, not so much. I mean, Talanka doesn't bring it up, and again, they would have been hesitant to talk about things like that. However, interestingly, in 48, with the creation of the State of Israel, there is a committee that exists in the Soviet Union called the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee that was created during the war, largely as a propaganda body. And when the Israeli state is created, and for a short time, the Soviets are sympathetic to the Israelis. A lot of Soviet Jews send letters to the committee saying they want to go to Israel and help fight for Israel's independence. And kind of say, like, we're Jews, we want to go to our homeland. And the committee is in a very odd position because it's an official body, and they're kind of trying to find a way to say, no, your homeland is here. It's not in Israel, it's here in the Soviet Union. So it's not to say that those inclinations didn't exist. But of course, in 45, there's no state of Israel to go to. I mean, there's Palestine, but great question.
If I may, a related question.
Yep.
When both diarists are working hard to try to figure the Soviet state as their homeland, you pointed to all kinds of positive ideological associations that they attach to that.
Mm-hmm.
When they work to attach their Jewishness to some kind of identity of a homeland, is there any clear positive valence to their Jewishness other than nostalgia?
I think in most cases, not really. It's mostly nostalgia. In some cases, it is. In some cases, it is attending some rituals, as mentioned, Jewish communal practices that prompt that identification. But to the extent that we see it, it's and I think we need to take this idealism to some extent on its for what it is, and that again, these are young people and they've been raised within a certain ideological climate. I mean, Talanka is writing these slogans on his diary. He doesn't, you don't publish diaries, and there's no sense that he's about to publish this thing. So I think they're earnest about it. But largely, we see this sort of Jewish identity, recognition of Jewish identity come out of anti-Semitic experiences with anti-Semitism, and with other examples I've written about how, especially younger kids, come home and say, "Am I a Jew?" because they hadn't confronted, "Am I a Žid?" which is a pejorative term. That was used in in Russian, and they're really shocked by this discovery that they're somehow different than their Soviet non-Jewish counterparts. So it's largely a sense of being cast out of the community that they assumed that they were a part of. But yes.
Do you know about what knowledge they might have had of what was going on in the camps and the Holocaust during this period?
Right. Yeah. What knowledge? The question was about what knowledge people had about what was going on in the camps and in other parts of the Soviet Union, where there were fewer camps but massacre sites all over. Yeah. I don't. They don't tend to write about that as much. I mean, Talanka writes a lot about what he sees in the Soviet press, and the traditional narrative has been that the Soviet press, like the Soviet state, didn't talk about the Holocaust, but talked about murders of Soviet civilians. Multiple scholars have now shown that that's not the case. Particularly earlier in the war, they published articles that talked about Jews specifically being killed. So they and that was what people were reading, in the Soviet press. At the same time, they didn't have the whole picture, and if we look at Holocaust testimonies, people who were living, in Warsaw didn't believe what was happening in Treblinka. So it's hard to imagine that people living in Kazakhstan could have had the sense, could have understood. So they knew that Jews were being targeted, but they certainly, so they were getting snippets of information, but certainly not, this is what's actually going on. And in fact, I mean, at the beginning of the war in 41, in a lot of Jewish families, they write about how there was a real debate within the family: do we evacuate or do we not evacuate? It wasn't a clear-cut thing. Oh, the Nazis are coming. we're Jews, we need to get out of here. It was, many families really disagreed, and there were a lot of divisions on this. My grandmother's family, my grandmother's mother came from a large Jewish family in Kiev, well-off Jewish family, several siblings, and the older brother, who was sort of the head of the family, said, "We're not going anywhere." He was an orthodontist. He had been educated in Germany, and he decided that he would have a much easier time with the Germans than with the Soviets. And he told the family to stay. The only reason I'm alive is because my great-grandfather, my grandmother's father, I think was kind of like a Bundist. He was a member of the party, and he worked for the Telegraph. The Telegraph was being evacuated to Kuibyshev, to Samara, what is now Samara, and he said, well, no, we're going. And they got on one of the last trains, him, his wife, my grandmother, who was a kid, and or teenager, really, and I think her aunt. But the rest of the 13 members of the family are in Babi Yar, perished. So this, granted, that's, summer of 41, but there had already been killings, and the sense of, there's certainly not this universal sense of Jews have to get out, and the Jews who stay are going to be killed. Obviously, when these people come back, they discover what's happened. The Polish Jews obviously confront their communities that had been devastated. The Soviet Jews confront their own communities who had been devastated. And this is in part why few people talk about this experience, because they feel like evacuation isn't really an important part of the story because of what happened to everybody else. So even my own grandparents, who I was very close to, when I asked to record their experiences of evacuation, I had to convince them that this was something that they should talk about and that I wanted to learn about, because they said that's not important. Why would you want to learn about evacuation? That's sort of, so what? And I had really had to push them to talk about it. So I guess there's a really interesting publication. If we had wings, we would fly to you. That's based on the correspondence of one family in the North Caucasus. The families in the North Caucasus, one of the siblings, one of the brothers, is already in evacuation in, I think he might be in Kazakhstan, and they're corresponding to with one another in 41, 42, trying to figure out if they can get out, if they should get out, and it really reflects this sort of, uncertainty.
Okay, so I guess we will.
There's one more.
I was just wondering if the experience of the evacuees, which you talked about a little bit, was he started out conflict with this whole idealism of the Soviet Union, and having gone back, did the experience of the evacuees returning home undermine that Soviet ideal?
Right.
Over time.
Yeah, thank you. So the question was whether the experience of evacuation undermined idealism and kind of belief in the Soviet system, in Soviet principles, if I understand it correctly. So part of my claim in my manuscript is that yes, I think it did. And it's hard to say. It's kind of, it's squishy, right? In the sense that people don't tend to, in the 1950, write, let me tell you, the evacuation was the moment when I decided that, things were not things were not as advertised. But I think for a lot of people who came from privileged, and when I say privileged, I mean Soviet privileged, somewhat elite professional backgrounds in the Soviet Union, and had benefited from the upward mobility and the opportunities provided by the Soviet Union, so who had been quite enthusiastic about the Soviet project before the war were confronted during the war with some of these inequalities, discrimination, kind of lack of fulfillment of the promises. And I think for many, it does sow a seed that people are beginning to see the state in a different way. And we do have accounts of Jews saying that the first time Soviet Jews writing that the first time they saw themselves as Jews was during the war in evacuation. So that it kind of, and it's not, and then of course this is followed up by anti-Semitic campaigns launched by the Soviet government in the late 40s and quota systems. So that I think that obviously it builds on that sense of we're not actually wanted here, or we don't have the opportunities, and the state isn't giving us what it said it would. But
That sounds specific to
the Jews, yeah, I think.
What about like everybody else?
What about everybody else? Again, it's harder to say. I think that is the case to some extent with a broader. I see the Jewish case as kind of the extreme because of anti-Semitism. But I think what we see in the Soviet Union in the post-war period is a differing relationship between the state and the citizens. The dissipation of a lot of this idealism and patriotism that we see in the 30s of like, I will do anything and I will die for the Soviet Union because I'm so like gung-ho about this. We see a youth that's a lot more disengaged in politics and much more interested in other types of things. And I think part of the reason that we see that is that people have had these experiences and they're no longer drinking the Kool-Aid in the same way that they had been before.
So clearly there's much more to be said, and I invite you all to the conversation one floor down in the reception lounge. But for now, let's thank Natalie very much for the interesting.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.